America's foreign wars end in military victory. There are unconditional peace treaties and celebrations. But Vietnam is different. Negotiations for a peace settlement go on longer than World War II. December 1972. The first sustained bombing of Hanoi. It is designed to bring North Vietnam to the peace table. The so-called Christmas bombing brings widespread condemnation. A treaty soon follows, and for America, the war is over. But in Vietnam, the fighting goes on.
The U.S. tries for 8 years to bomb North Vietnam to the peace table.
Stand by to release. Ready now. Bombs fired.
And as the talks drag out, the bombing escalates. The calculated use of this negotiating weapon by President Nixon and Henry Kissinger is described by Nixon aide John Ehrlichman.
Bear in mind that Henry and Nixon played good guy, bad guy in these negotiations, just like a couple of cops. Henry would go to the negotiations and say, and I have this from Nixon, I know this, it was their strategy. He would say to the North Vietnamese, look, I represent this crazy fellow Nixon over there. There's no telling what he might do. I am a very reasonable man. I am a man of peace. I oppose these bombings and so on, but there's no telling what Nixon might do. So you'd better make your deal with me because I'm going to be easier to get along with than he is. And then if he got to a sticking point, he would report back and they would unleash the bombers or some kind of an offensive or something so that Henry could go back and say, see what happens when you don't make your deal with me? Then he back there in the White House does something crazy.
December 1972. Peace talks have broken down. President Nixon delivers an ultimatum. Hanoi must resume negotiations or the capital will be bombed. Hanoi ignores the warning. December 18th, day one of the bombing of Hanoi. The U.S. deploys 121 giant B-52s from bases 5,000 miles away.
Communist defenses swing into place. The B-52s converge on Hanoi and Haiphong at 40,000 feet. Each plane drops 108 heavy bombs.
Stand by to release. Ready now. Bombs fired.
On the first day, the B-52s drop almost 12,000 bombs. The U.S. says the targets are strictly military. Hanoi has 600 Soviet-designed twin 37mm anti-aircraft guns. They are only effective against the support planes. But there's a sophisticated missile defense system. From 200 mobile sites, Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles search out the B-52s. The SAM-2 missiles reach 60,000 feet. Three B-52s are brought down on day one. A senior Hanoi official, Ha Van Lao.
On avait un slogan.
We had a slogan, fight and build, fight and produce at the same time.
Dans les grandes agglomérations,
In the large urban centers, which could become targets for the bombings,
des objectifs pour les bombardements,
the children, the old people, those who couldn't participate in the fighting, were evacuated to the country.
participer au combat, sont évacués à la campagne. Les écoles, les usines
The schools,
sont
the
dispersées
factories
aussi
were
à la
also
campagne.
moved to the country
Et pour
in
continuer
order
les
for the
études
people
et
to
pour continuer
continue
la
their
production.
studies and production. And even the city
Les
markets
marchés
were
aussi,
moved.
n'est-ce pas, dans les villes,
But
sont
everyday
dispersés.
life
Mais on
always
continue toujours la
continued.
vie normale.
Day 2. The tension in Hanoi builds. More SAM missiles are rushed to the city. North Vietnamese gunners study the B-52 flight pattern. They find it being repeated. The defenders believe they have found a tactical weakness. Radar systems, missile positions, and timing are rechecked. The Battle of Hanoi is to be the politically decisive battle. Both sides confidently expected to get peace terms domestically acceptable. To demonstrate the military stalemate, both sides must give and take terrible punishment. But that has been the pattern for 20 years. The victor over the French, General Giap, now personally directs Hanoi's defense, and this battle is as desperate as the history that led to it.
In 1954, in the war against the French, the Vietnamese communists established a tough fight-talk strategy. They win the decisive battle of Dien Bien Phu the day before peace talks open. The 1954 Geneva Agreement partitions Vietnam, but the North sets out to defeat the South by the same means: talk, then fight until the other side tires. The U.S. commits 500,000 combat troops to defend the South. And it gradually escalates bombing of the North. The U.S. strategy is also to bargain from strength. President Johnson expects the bombing to force Hanoi to terms within 6 months. Ho Chi Minh's government believes time is on its side. It had fought the French for 9 years. By the time the U.S. enters the conflict, Hanoi has been on a war footing for 20 years. Hanoi states its minimum position: total American withdrawal and reunification of Vietnam. Both sides believe they can impose a military solution. Hanoi sends enough men south to match the American troop buildup. As the communists increase the infiltration, the U.S. systematically bombs the North. The communist 1968 Tet Offensive ends 3 years of stalemate. The simultaneous attack on South Vietnam cities undermines American confidence. President Johnson freezes U.S. troop levels and suspends bombing of the North. Both sides agree to commence negotiations in Paris. Richard Nixon is elected president. His Secretary of Defense, Melvin Laird.
But the day I entered the Pentagon, I stated I'd be there for 1 day longer than 4 years, and no more. And that my objectives were to withdraw American forces from Vietnam in an honorable fashion, because I did not support the large ground involvement of American forces in Southeast Asia.
Nixon believes greater pressure will get better terms, but he makes a new effort in Paris, sending former Saigon Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge. The talks quickly stall.
Did not agree with our proposals that we start talking about restoration of the status of the demilitarized zone, or withdrawal of troops, or exchange of prisoners. I'm sorry to have to say this, it's too bad.
In 1969, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and Politburo member Le Duc Tho began meeting secretly. And Nixon orders secret bombing of communist supply bases in Cambodia. He is developing his own talk-fight strategy. Nixon keeps his pledge to withdraw troops. In July '69, 25,000 leave Vietnam. Nixon's policy is to pressure Hanoi while slowly handing back the war to the South Vietnamese. North Vietnam's Prime Minister Pham Van Dong.
President Nixon's way of withdrawing U.S. troops covers dark maneuvers to cling to South Vietnam and to perpetuate the division of our country. But those are desperate efforts, which are doomed to total defeat.
But Hanoi continues the secret talks in Paris. Kissinger aide Winston Lord.
In fact, the secret negotiations were meaningful. We were making specific proposals. They were responding. We would usually go on a Saturday morning, just be 3 or 4 of us along with Kissinger, get on the plane, fly across the Atlantic all day Saturday, land in central France, get out and transfer to another small French jet arranged by President Pompidou's office, and fly from there to the outskirts of Paris. We'd get a night's sleep. We would negotiate with the Vietnamese on a Sunday, and then with a change of time, we could fly back late Sunday afternoon, still get home Sunday night, go in the office the next morning as if nothing had happened.
Kissinger operates in total secrecy for 2.5 years. In May '71, Kissinger drops the demand for the withdrawal of North Vietnamese troops from the South. It is the most significant concession of the war, but Hanoi does not respond. It demands the removal of South Vietnam's President Thieu. Kissinger does not inform Thieu of this. Saigon's ambassador to Washington, Bui Diem.
We knew very little about the secret talks in Paris. I don't know to what extent my president, Mr. Thieu, by then knew about all the substance of the secret talks. But as ambassador in the United States, I knew vaguely that there are talks going on, but I didn't know about the substance of it.
President Thieu criticizes the secret diplomacy.
What the American has done wrong in Vietnam from the beginning is they have done the war themselves on behalf of Vietnamese people. And after that, they have take on hand themselves the peace negotiation.
Kissinger's priorities are in Moscow and Peking. Vietnam becomes part of an overall settlement with the major communist powers. Journalist Tad Schultz.
If a settlement were to be reached, it had to be worked out in the context of a larger communist entity or entities. So you had there American foreign policy working on several tracks for a number of reasons, in which essentially Nixon and Kissinger perceived Vietnam, as Kissinger said himself at one point, as a sideshow.
My son's been a prisoner for 3.5 years. I want him home.
The U.S. public sees only a continuing war. Protest mounts.
You, more than any other people in this country, are a living testimony to the fact that the American people do not wish to provide the manpower for this ugly war, this illegal, immoral war, which has destroyed our own country, even as we destroy innocent victims abroad.
The dissent in the U.S. encourages Hanoi to hold out for concessions. Kissinger's military aide, General Alexander Haig.
These anguishing days, the complex forces that were at work, especially the declining support base at home, certainly didn't give Dr. Kissinger the kind of leeway that an absence of those pressures would have provided. So he was working against a series of converging deadlines, congressional legislation, which would have forced the withdrawal of the American activity in Southeast Asia, intransigence on the part of the North Vietnamese negotiators who were armed with strong support from the Soviet Union at the time, and also the consequences of their own failures in a military sense in South Vietnam, and they were rather evident.
January 1972. The South's army is collapsing. U.S. troop strength is only 130,000. Chief of Staff General Westmoreland warns of worse to come.
It would seem that the enemy is preparing himself for a major offensive. This is well known to you. Indications are that this offensive will take place in the northern region and in the Highlands area. In fact, I believe the objective is a political objective.
Peace talks reconvene in Paris, but again break down. The North Vietnamese and U.S. delegates blame each other.
Well, that was quite a session. Not exactly the kind of, quote, serious negotiation, unquote, that they told us they wanted us to come back for.
Spring 1972. North Vietnam launches a major offensive in a bid to gain concessions. Nixon responds with heavier airstrikes against the North. But by now, Soviet aid gives Hanoi more time than Nixon has. In late '72, Kissinger pressures the Soviets to support meaningful negotiations. Kissinger assistant Winston Lord.
In September, when we had met a few weeks before, the Vietnamese had begun to move. Instead of going flatly for a coalition government and the overthrow of Thieu, they were beginning to play with the language, not in a way that was anywhere near satisfactory. But we had a sense they might be willing to be reasonable at last.
The Americans made a very major concession in '71 on no longer demanding North Vietnamese military withdrawal from the South as a condition for peace. A year and a half later, the North Vietnamese made their great concession, the heart of which was in effect that they would let Thieu remain in Saigon as president in the framework of a peace treaty.
That was the key breakthrough, because it was on that date, through their plan, that they, for the first time after agonizing years of negotiations, separated out a political settlement from a military settlement and made a peace that we considered honorable possible. He knew that the North Vietnamese had made a major step forward, but he wasn't sure that we had all the Vietnamese parties lined up yet. So that was sort of the only restrained note, some people feeling that the North Vietnamese had not gone as far as Kissinger and I thought they had. But basically, it was a sense of tremendous achievement and a breakthrough. We got to work immediately overnight writing a counter draft, and we negotiated for several more days to make it a better document.
There is one major snag. Kissinger has yet to tell Thieu of his peace plan. October '72. Kissinger meets Thieu. The U.S. and North Vietnam have agreed on a settlement. Nixon stands for re-election in 3 weeks. He has promised peace, but Thieu now balks.
I have to fight for the fate of my country. And the American would like to impose me to my people something they cannot accept. So we have to discuss, even with the very hard discussion, you know. I have to act as a patriot, as a Vietnamese, and as a president who is responsible for the fate of our country. It's our normal reaction.
So it was a very painful time. We presented it to him. He listened impassively, and we took encouragement because he didn't immediately denounce it. Thought about it overnight, asked some questions which we thought were encouraging, but then came back and blasted the agreement.
What I didn't agree at all consists on 2 points, 2 very crucial points first. First, in the draft of the peace agreement that Mr. Kissinger have written together and agreed with North Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese troops has been allowed to stay forever in South Vietnam. And no clause at all in the draft of that treaty has mentioned how and when the North Vietnamese troops will leave South Vietnam to go back to North Vietnam.
Having listened to Thieu for endless hours in Saigon. Kissinger, on the plane flying back to Washington, said to one of his associates, one of his aides on the plane, something to the effect, you know, this war simply cannot go for another 4 years. We have to end it even if it takes a very brutal, this is a verbatim word, a very brutal way of doing away with this war.
Even though they say that I'm unreasonable man, but they recognize I am a very patriotic man too. They have to recognize that. And they have to recognize that I am right as a Vietnamese and as a Vietnamese president and the man who fight for his country. I am not a yes man, I am not a puppet, I am not agree with everything the American would like to impose to our people.
Fearing the collapse of negotiations, Kissinger announces that peace is at hand. Nixon has only 2 weeks to force Thieu's compliance. Hanoi has imposed an October 31st deadline, but technicalities raised by Hanoi delay the signing.
We tried to be reasonable. We tried to keep the demands for change within reasonable limits. We tried to accommodate some of Hanoi's changes, but they began to pile up these changes, and by December it was clear that they were playing on our public opinion, undercutting us at home, and stonewalling us in Paris. And there was no choice but to break off the negotiations. Then the president felt that in order to demonstrate to Hanoi that we couldn't be trifled with in this way, and frankly to demonstrate our toughness to Thieu, because we knew we would have to lean very hard on Thieu to get an agreement, no matter what agreement we came out of, he undertook the bombing.
At this point, the American interest in relation to South Vietnam is served by an extra delay. So we make it appear that diplomacy is breaking down, that strong measures are necessary. The North Vietnamese, who maybe were themselves too clever by half, who had really caused this whole problem, are beginning also to respond militarily to some extent. One thing leads to another, and suddenly the United States, in the final spasm, if you will, of military activity in Indochina, launches the famous Christmas bombings.
Beginning December 18, 1972, the B-52s bomb Hanoi for the first time for 11 days and nights. The city is ready with emergency plans. An expert on North Vietnamese tactics, Brian Jenkins.
They had the most elaborate measures to deal with the bombing in terms of relocation of their industries, in terms of routes of transportation. I don't mean to say that the bombing was not having, was not hurting them. No country can be bombed and take it complacently and say that does not have some effect. But bombing was something they had dealt with before, that they were prepared to deal with.
In the first 2 days, Hanoi discovers a weakness in American tactics. Day 3, waves of B-52s are approaching on an unchanging flight pattern. It is a night attack, the most severe test of Hanoi's defenses. Again, more than 200 missiles are launched.
500,000 people shelter and wait. 6 B-52s are shot down in 9 hours. American officials call Day 3 their darkest hour. The pilots blame poor planning and demand changes. Washington considers stopping the Hanoi raids entirely, but then decides to try new tactics. Hanoi's newspapers show photos of 5 captured B-52 pilots. Adding to international criticism of the bombing, the captive pilots make statements at a news conference.
My first impression on observing the areas that had been bombed was complete shock. I was extremely surprised at the area that we had actually hit. The fact that I could observe no military targets anywhere in the area.
Bombed civilian areas of Hanoi are shown to the captured pilots in publicized tours. American officials insist that only military targets are selected. They contend that any civilian damage results from proximity to military targets. The North Vietnamese show the pilots hospitals, schools, and residential areas destroyed by the B-52s.
We observed a row of shops and living quarters which had been bombed, and also a hospital which had been badly damaged, and we observed a school which had been bombed heavily.
At the end of day 3, Hanoi, for the first time ever, gives civilian casualties. 215 killed, another 325 wounded. The Pope and the United Nations condemned the bombing. Newspaper reaction. From Japan, quote, "Nothing is more grotesque." From Buenos Aires, quote, "Genocide." From West Germany, quote, "A crime against humanity." Says the London Times, Nixon ordered saturation bombing. This is not the conduct of a man who wants peace very badly. Says the New York Times, civilized man will be horrified. In the U.S., Congress is threatening to cut off all U.S. aid to South Vietnam. Nixon and Kissinger exchanged messages with Hanoi, but the two sides disagree on conditions for new talks. Day 4. The B-52s now attack Haiphong Harbor. Soviet and Chinese ships report damage. So do 6 embassies. Those of Cuba, Egypt, India, East Germany, Bulgaria, and Albania. Hanoi's Bac Mai hospital is virtually destroyed. Hospital officials claim that 25 doctors and nurses are killed. Hanoi charges that the U.S. is deliberately hitting civilian targets. U.S. officials point out that the hospital is only 1,000 yards from the Bac Mai military airfield. By day 4, U.S. losses total 9 B-52s and 4 F-111 fighter bombers. 43 American pilots are killed or captured. Asked if the bombing of Hanoi is his country's darkest hour, Prime Minister Pham Van Dong reflects on 27 years of war.
To tell the truth, I cannot answer your question immediately. It needs some reflection. But I must say that we faced a lot of difficult times. But however difficult they may be, we are always sure of final victory. Confident in our people's strength. And all the more determined to strive forward. It is in those times of difficulty that our people showed unimagined, unparalleled strength. That's the truth.
Nixon and Kissinger now face an all-round critical situation. With pilot losses increasing and political support disappearing, Hanoi still refuses to negotiate. They decide to continue the bombing with a pause on Christmas Day. At Hanoi's Catholic Cathedral, midnight mass is celebrated during the brief bombing reprieve. Hanoi's streets have a false quiet. There are new street-side shelters, ready, it seems, for a long siege. The people are told to copy the soldiers and dig deep to survive the bombing. Defense Minister Giap now has almost no SAM missiles left. 400 have been used in the first 2 days. Only 14 will be fired on the last day. Because rail lines, roads, and bridges are destroyed, Soviet replacements cannot reach Hanoi. Time is now against both sides. During the Christmas pause, the U.S. readies for even bigger raids. Nixon is threatened with a congressionally forced halt to the bombing. He tells Hanoi the air attacks will cease if negotiations resume by January 3rd. Hanoi wants a later date. The United States now launches the biggest raids of the war. December 26th, day 8 of the bombing. About 4,000 tons or 12,000 bombs are loaded at bases in Guam and Thailand. Hanoi is prepared, says Ha Van Lao.
Our artillerymen were ready 24 hours a day on the loading platforms of the anti-aircraft guns or on the ramps of the rockets. 24 hours out of 24. And the American strategic air attack was of a breadth never before known in the history of war. From the 18th to the 29th of December, 1972, that is to say, 12 consecutive days and nights, the American imperialists dropped 100,000 tons of bombs on Hanoi and Haiphong. That's the equivalent of 5 American atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima in 1945.
The B-52 force comprises 120 bombers and 100 support planes in 7 waves.
Roger, copy. I see him at this time. Pilot nav.
Roger, nav.
Coming up the bomber and heading to 281.
281, you want that
The
heading
bombers
now?
are over Hanoi and Haiphong only 15 minutes. This time they detect far fewer missiles, only 68, and lose only 2 B-52s. The intensity of the 15-minute bombing leaves some residential areas in total ruin. Cam Tien district is leveled. Officials widely publicize civilian casualties, claiming 200 dead and 5,000 homeless in this one district. These are official North Vietnamese films. The U.S. again insists it is aiming at military targets. Officials point out that civilian casualties are very light compared to bombing raids of World War II. The Can Tien incident brings angry editorials in the United States. New York Times, shame on earth. Los Angeles Times, beyond all reason. But in a later visit, a New York Times reporter calls civilian damage grossly overstated. The Baltimore Sun finds civilian damage minor compared to the military targets. Premier Dong on overall civilian casualties.
Frankly speaking, we did not make any statistics. That is the truth, because it was very difficult to make statistics. What I can tell you is that our human losses were not so great as in other wars. In comparison with other large wars in the world, our losses were relatively light. An evidence of this is that during 30 years of long and hard wars in which the quantity of bombs and shells used were estimated to be several times larger than that of World War II, we Vietnamese continued to live, to fight and work, and our population increased. This shows that our casualties were not great.
nhân khẩu lại tăng lên.
No amount of bombing could break Hanoi's morale, says analyst Brian Jenkins.
The cumulative effect of the bombing could ultimately have reduced North Vietnam to ashes, to rubble. But even amidst that rubble, I believe that the North Vietnamese still would have had the stomach to fight.
Day 11. Hanoi's Soviet MiG fighters now take the brunt of the battle. Ammunition is critically short. 1,000 SAM missiles have been used. Now very few are in evidence.
Okay, turning 281.
EW, co-pilot, picking up any signals? Oh, roger, co-pilot, just a normal acquisition signals, no threats at this time.
By now, over 100,000 bombs have been dropped on Hanoi and Haiphong. But 33 airmen are dead or missing. Day 12, a smoldering silence. Hanoi tells Nixon and Kissinger that it will resume peace negotiations in Paris within 5 days. At midnight, December 29th, the bombing is called off. A Kissinger aide, Winston Lord.
Unpleasant as it is, the fact remains within a very short period. In the middle of this bombing, we got a message from Hanoi saying they wanted to negotiate again. And when we went back and began negotiating again in January, it was clear from the very first meeting that they wanted an agreement. They moved very quickly, and we wrapped it up very expeditiously. And the only thing that occurred between the December period when they were totally intransigent and the January period when they were totally forthcoming was the Christmas bombing. So one has to, in the agony of these years and in the agony of diplomacy and conflict, to weigh the unpleasantness of having to resort to force against the fact that it did, in fact, achieve the breakthrough, and there's no other explanation for Hanoi changing its attitude. And we stopped it as soon as it was clear that they were willing to negotiate.
The bombing is North Vietnam's last serious threat from the U.S. For both sides, time, resources, and options are all but exhausted. With this situation, both sides want an immediate settlement. The U.S. now pressures Saigon to accept terms or face a total end to American aid. Military advisor Alexander Haig.
President Chiu was facing two impossible alternatives. The one was to accept the conditions. The other was to reject them and be faced with a cutoff of American support. He took the lesser of two evils.
I have accepted unwillingly because at any time we have been put in the dilemma not to accept the peace agreement, to continue to fight with what? Because the American aid will be cut.
Now, Hanoi, Washington, and Saigon agree to terms. North Vietnam will keep its troops in the south. President Nixon announces that for America, the war is over.
The following statement is being issued at this moment in Washington and Hanoi. At 12:30 Paris time today, January 23, 1973, the agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam was initialed by Dr. Henry Kissinger on behalf of the United States and Special Advisor Le Duc Tho on behalf of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The agreement will be formally signed by the parties participating in the Paris Conference on Vietnam on January 27, 1973 at the International Conference Center in Paris. The ceasefire will take effect at 2400 Greenwich Mean Time, January 27, 1973.
Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho win the Nobel Peace Prize. Tho rejects it. The South Vietnamese call the agreement a communist victory. Cabinet Minister Nguyen Thien Hung.
All the major points that the communists insist on at the beginning of the Nixon administration were totally given to them at the end. And that is not justified for the Vietnamese as well as the American sacrifice of 4 years during the Nixon administration.
As the formal peace documents are signed, South and North Vietnamese troops continue fighting. Both sides accuse each other of expanding the war. President Thieu claims the North does not want peace.
And they realize well that after the signing the peace treaty, certainly with the domestic problem in the United States, they guess that the United States will not intervene again, will not react again, and will not be able to provide enough military aid and economic aid for South Vietnam. So they will have a free hand to renew the war and to overrun us. That's that the North Vietnamese has in mind by signing the treaty.
To reassure Thieu, President Nixon makes an extraordinary promise. He secretly pledges full U.S. retaliation if South Vietnam's existence is threatened.
He pledges solemnly that if the North Vietnamese violate seriously the peace agreement, the United States will react rigorously. And secondly, the Vietnamization, so-called, will go along fully and completely under the financial aid, the economic aid, the military aid will be provided enough on time and as long as we need to counter the communists.
Nixon rushes $1 billion worth of military equipment to South Vietnam in the weeks before the peace signing. But an angry Congress increasingly cuts back financial aid, while the Soviet Union continues to support the North. Defense Secretary Laird.
With the tremendous influx of Russian equipment, I believe that kind of broke the back after 1973 of the South Vietnamese and destroyed their will and desire to a great extent.
Take, for example, the voting in the Congress of July of '73, after the Paris Accords had been arrived at, when the American Congress voted to cease all bombing in Southeast Asia. I said at the time to President Nixon, this is the end of South Vietnam. We have just stripped our sanctions from the '73 Accords. That proved to be precisely the fact. It was one of the most tragic actions taken by the American legislature in my living memory.
North Vietnam's peace negotiators are welcomed home as victors. The peace agreement is a repetition of Hanoi's successful strategy 19 years earlier. Now, 150,000 communist troops are in place in South Vietnam. The supply routes are open. Thieu feels his country has been sacrificed.
It's much better to let the Americans speak by themselves. And I have heard that many very important men who have a great responsibility in Vietnam, who say that we have no other word than to say betrayal. Betrayal.
In President Nixon's defense, aide John Ehrlichman says the Vietnam peace settlement had a wider context.
But it seems to me that you can make the case, as an outsider, that he won a great prize in opening China and in forging some kind of an alliance with China vis-a-vis Russia. That's a great prize to have won. And if the price of that was a cynical peace in Vietnam, then historians are going to have to weigh the morality and the pragmatism and all these other things that historians like to weigh.
Nixon's secret Vietnam commitment is never tested. Watergate destroys his presidency. The Vietnam Peace Treaty exists only on paper. Fighting continues even as the agreement is signed. The Watergate scandal destroys both Nixon's presidency and any prospect of U.S. intervention in Vietnam. As Nixon resigns, August 1974, Hanoi is preparing its final offensive. In 1974, peace negotiator Le Duc Tho gets a very different assignment. He infiltrates into South Vietnam to help prepare the 1975 offensive. Hanoi's planning is outlined by one of its senior strategists, Ha Van Lao.
Voilà, de la fin de 1974.
From the end of 1974 until the beginning of 1975, the leadership of our party did a scientific analysis of the current war situation and reached an historic decision. Our leadership decided on the basis of the report that the strength of our enemy and ourselves had fundamentally changed in our favor. And on that basis, our leaders saw that the favorable strategic moment had come for us to undertake the last battle to liberate the South. They decided to mobilize all the people and all our armed forces. And in combination with those in the popular uprisings, we then began a general offensive and ended the war.
Hanoi plans to invade in the spring of 1975. It is confident the U.S. will not intervene, exhausted by both the war and the Watergate scandal. But Hanoi anticipates 2 years of bitter fighting. It will actually take only 55 days. South Vietnam, without U.S. troops or aid, will collapse. Its president later calls the peace treaty a death warrant.
Just like a couple of cops. Henry would go to the negotiations and say, and I have this from Nixon, I know this, it was their strategy. He would say to the North Vietnamese, look, I represent this crazy fellow Nixon over there. There's no telling what he might do. I am a very reasonable man. I am a man of peace. I oppose these bombings and so on, but there's no telling what Nixon might do. So you'd better make your deal with me because I'm going to be easier to get along with than he is. And then if he got to a sticking point, he would report back and they would unleash the bombers or some kind of an offensive or something so that Henry could go back and say, see what happens when you don't make your deal with me? Then he back there in the White House does something crazy.
December 1972. Peace talks have broken down. President Nixon delivers an ultimatum. Hanoi must resume negotiations or the capital will be bombed. Hanoi ignores the warning. December 18th, day one of the bombing of Hanoi. The U.S. deploys 121 giant B-52s from bases 5,000 miles away.
Communist defenses swing into place.
60.
The B-52s converge on Hanoi and Haiphong at 40,000 feet. Each plane drops 108 heavy bombs.
Stand by to release. Ready, ready, now. Bombs ready.
On the first day, the B-52s drop almost 12,000 bombs. The U.S. says the targets are strictly military. Hanoi has 600 Soviet-designed twin 37mm anti-aircraft guns. They are only... The U.S. tries for 8 years to bomb North Vietnam to the peace table.
Stand by to release. Ready, ready, now. Bombs ready.
And as the talks drag out, the bombing escalates. The calculated use of this negotiating weapon by President Nixon and Henry Kissinger is described by Nixon aide John Ehrlichman.
Bear in mind that Henry and Nixon played good guy, bad guy in these negotiations.
Effective against the support planes. But there's a sophisticated missile defense system. From 200 mobile sites, Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles search out the B-52s. The SAM-2 missiles reach 60,000 feet. Three B-52s are brought down on day one. A senior Hanoi official, Hao Van Lao.
On avait un slogan.
We had a slogan, fight and build. Fight and produce at the same time.
Dans les grandes agglomérations,
in the large urban centers, which could become targets for the bombings, the children, the old people, those who couldn't participate in the fighting, were evacuated to the country. The schools, the factories were also moved to the country in order for the people to continue their studies and production. And even the...
America's foreign wars end in military victory. There are unconditional peace treaties and celebrations. But Vietnam is different. Negotiations for a peace settlement go on longer than World War II. December 1972. The first sustained bombing of Hanoi. It is designed to bring North Vietnam to the peace table. The so-called Christmas bombing brings widespread condemnation. A treaty soon follows, and for America, the war is over. But in Vietnam, the fighting goes on.